Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I would love to welcome you to Science on Tap Online. As you know, we are here to talk about the neuroscience of real-life monsters, psychopaths, CEOs, and politicians with Dr. Octavio Choi, who is a forensic psychiatrist. And Tavi has done this talk a couple of times in the past, and we asked him to repeat it here this evening and add some new things because we figured that right before Halloween and right before the election was a great time to be talking about this topic. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I noticed in the chat somebody was asking about whether or not the attendees would be recorded, and no, you will not be recorded. It is just me and Tavi who will be on screen and recorded, so you don't have to worry about you being on screen or having your microphone on at all. So just a quick note on that. So we will be, we're going to start here in just a second. I'm going to tell you a few things. Tavi is going to speak for around an hour, maybe a little bit longer, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please write your questions in the chat. If you're watching on Zoom, you can write in the chat or the Q&A. If you're watching on Facebook, you can write it in the comments. We have folks, some of our volunteers who are watching all of those chat channels, and they will be sending those questions to me, and I'll be choosing which ones to ask Tavi on screen once we get to the Q&A section. So we encourage you to write questions, and are glad that you are engaged and interested in the topic. So thank you. So I know that we have a lot of people here this evening, and I know that there are probably a lot of new people here this evening as well. So I just wanted to give a quick, brief intro to what Science on Tap is. We are an event series that is based in Portland, Oregon, and we have been running events in person in theaters for around 7 or 8 years. And we've been running mostly weekly events since online since April. And tonight is actually our 32nd event in the year 2020. So we've done quite a lot of events. And our goal is to make science accessible, fun, and meaningful, particularly for adults, because we think it's important that adults understand how science works. And so we're glad that you're here and interested in science. And also, we record our events and we put them on our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/scienceontap.orwa. You can also find our podcasts on there. Our podcast is called A Scientist Walks into a Bar, and all of the episodes are available on the YouTube page as well. And the podcasts are different than the events in that we interview some of the same author or same speakers, but we have some other people that we interview and talk to as well. So I encourage you to check that out. This talk will be available on our YouTube channel in the next 2 or 3 days or so, depending on how fast our video volunteer Steve can get things put together. So thanks. And also, before we get started, I just wanted to send out a quick request. We at Science on Tap need your help. We are trying to get more science into the world, which we think is really an important thing to do. And as such, we've been trying to make our events free to the public. And in fact, this event we originally had as a ticketed event, but we decided to change it to a free event instead so that more people could participate. And indeed, a lot more people participated, and that meant that we had to bump up the number of people that we could allow into our Zoom channel, which means that it costs more money for us to do this. And so if you value what we do here this evening, we would greatly appreciate it if you would consider donating either a one-time donation. You can donate through our nonprofit partner, which is Make You Think. You can see the link there. Or you can join our Patreon also for Make You Think. And it will go a long way to help keeping these programs available for the next year as well. We will put this slide up again at the end, but just wanted to put in a quick plug at the beginning. Okay, with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and invite our speaker this evening, Dr. Octavio Choi. Welcome, Tavi.
Hi, thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you, everyone. Of course, I just put a fig bar in my mouth, so I'm chewing and talking at the same time, but I'm so happy to be here. And I see we have like 465 participants on Zoom. I think we have a few hundred more over Facebook Live. So I just so appreciate that we're getting this many people and paying attention to a science talk. It's kind of a miracle. I'm really happy you're here and hope to make it worth your while. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Great. So I am a forensic neuropsychiatrist with a background in neuroscience. I have a PhD in neuroscience. I'm really interested in how neuroscience affects court proceedings. And psychopathy and the neuroscience of psychopathy is related to that interest. So happy Halloween, everyone. I'm probably dating myself, but I grew up on these old campy horror movies like Halloween. Of course, there's Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street, all right, Pinhead, right, Jason. All these folks, wonderful horror movies. But you know, when I look back at them now, they almost seem quaint to me. They seem kind of almost charming and quaint. I'll tell you the monsters that that are in my nightmares these days. People like this guy. Definitely this guy. What do you guys think about this guy? Bet a lot of people have feelings about this guy. I certainly do. And there's President Trump. So when a psychiatrist talks about Trump in a public arena, ethical issues arise. And specifically, there's something called the Goldwater Rule, which was established by the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, that basically said it's unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement. And this Goldwater Rule comes from, the genesis of it is back in 1964. A magazine named Fact Magazine sent out a question to thousands of psychiatrists with the question, do you believe Barry Goldwater is psychologically fit to serve as president of the United States? So 2,400 psychiatrists responded, and about half said that he was not fit. And in the responses, there were a lot of really embarrassing responses. And as a psychiatrist, I read these responses and I really cringe. So a bunch of people said, you know, I think Goldwater is suffering from a chronic psychosis. Another one said he's basically a paranoid schizophrenic who decompensates from time to time. And by the way, I think since then it's been clearly established Goldwater was not a schizophrenic, you know, paranoid schizophrenic. Someone else said, I believe Goldwater is grossly psychotic. He has a serious thinking disorder. He's grandiose. He's suspicious, he's paranoid, he's impulsive, suggesting that he has poor control over his feelings and that he acts on angry impulses. This alone would make him an extremely psychologically unfit to serve as president. A president must not act on impulse, but in addition, he consciously wants to destroy the world with atomic bombs. He's a mass murderer at heart and a suicide. He is amoral and immoral, a dangerous lunatic, exclamation point. I find this quite embarrassing as a psychiatrist. But it also makes me a bit sober. I was born in the 70s, so I did not know Barry Goldwater at all. But reading this statement makes me think I should know a bit more about my history, because it suggests to me that maybe people like Trump are not a once in a century phenomenon. Maybe people like Trump pop up, you know, on a regular basis in politics. So the reason the Goldwater Rule was put in place was basically because of abuse, because a bunch of psychiatrists made these really childish kind of snap judgments with these definitive diagnoses. And basically the Goldwater Rule stands because a proper psychiatric evaluation is conducted with consent, right? So Trump has not consented for me to conduct a psychiatric evaluation on him. Offering a professional opinion requires careful medical history and a first-hand examination of a patient, ideally, so a face-to-face examination. When psychiatrists offer medical opinions about an individual they have not examined, they have the potential to stigmatize those with mental illness. So I just wanted to apologize in advance to all the psychopaths in the audience that, if they feel insulted that I am implying that President Trump is part of your crowd. Now, Trump, is such an extreme case of someone who seems quite dangerous in his role as the most powerful person on the planet, essentially, that a lot of psychiatrists have objected that the Goldwater Rule is no longer valid, basically because there's a duty to warn people as psychiatrists. In fact, a book was published in 2017, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, by 37 psychiatrists, essentially giving lots of opinions about his psychiatric condition. In response to this, the APA kind of clarified its Goldwater Rule, and they said, yeah, it still holds, you still don't want to make an official diagnosis, but It says the psychiatrist as a citizen may speak as any other citizen. He or she may observe the behavior and work of a public figure and support, oppose, or critique that public action. But the psychiatrist may not assume a professional role in voicing that critique in the form of a professional opinion. So be assured that I will not offer any professional opinions tonight. I will instead be offering many unprofessional opinions and many speculations. Nothing that you'd want to base a diagnosis on and make a treatment plan and stuff like that. But I do have a lot of expertise in psychopathy, and I know what you know about Trump. I don't have any access to special information, but I read the press clippings and I've read some of the books about him. And I'm going to juxtapose what I seem to know about Trump from the press and from the public data, and my knowledge of psychopathy. And I'll leave it to you to make your own opinion about what Trump is suffering from. So the AP also said, nothing in this opinion precludes a psychological profiling of historical figures aimed at enhancing public and governmental understanding of these individuals. Don't do a diagnosis, and the profiling should be based in peer-reviewed scholarship that meets relevant standards of academic scholarship. I feel pretty comfortable with this. What I'll present to you on psychopathy is informed by a rigorous reading of the literature. And I might do some psychological profiling, but I will not offer any diagnoses. So with that, let's proceed. So I think the most fundamental question to start off with, and it's a question I'll be coming back to repeatedly, is what is psychopathy? And there's various answers to this question, which is why we'll keep coming back to it. So let me start off with some examples. So imagine it's a slow Thursday night, you're kind of, you're looking for a date and you're swiping left and right on Tinder, and this guy shows up, Ted, 32, psychology student. Swipe left or swipe right? Now, most of you probably know you don't want to swipe right on this guy. This is Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in modern US history. He has confirmed to have murdered 35 women, all college students, and it's thought that he may have murdered actually over 100 people. He studied psychology in college, and he actually worked a peer counselor crisis hotline for a while, no doubt getting lots of valuable insights about people's vulnerabilities. He was described as charming and good looking, and he actually does look quite good looking. And he was very psychologically minded. He would, for instance, use crutches to kind of limp around to lure women and ask for assistance. They try to help him to his car. He'd put him in the car. He'd drive them, to a remote spot. Sexual assault followed by beating and killing. And he did that over and over and over again. When the police finally arrested him, he said, "I'm the most cold-blooded son of a bitch that you'll ever meet." So cold-blooded is kind of a core characteristics of psychopaths. And when asked about whether he felt guilty about what he did, he said, "Guilt? It's this mechanism we use to control people. It's an illusion. It's a kind of social control mechanism, and it's very unhealthy. It does terrible things to our bodies." Yes, guilt does do terrible things to our bodies, but sometimes we need to feel guilt, right, to guide us and to do the proper thing, right? But Ted Bundy apparently does not feel guilt, which is another characteristic of psychopaths. When he was asked, "Do you deserve to die?" he said, "Good question. I think society deserves to be protected from me and from people like me," right? So that's a really reasonable, rational answer. So psychopaths don't experience guilt, and they're very cold-blooded, but they're highly rational. Their cognitive functions are intact. And he scored 39 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but that's a very high score. He is almost a perfect psychopath. Now, people often confuse psychopathy and psychosis, so I just want to spend a few moments differentiating the two. So psychopathy is a personality disorder. The people who suffer from it are rational, meaning that they're not delusional, they understand what's happening around them. And it's not so people with psychopathy are not eligible for the insanity defense should they have criminal charges, although that might change. In contrast, people who are psychotic, so psychosis is a symptom of a severe mental illness, and the prototypical illness, psychotic illness, is schizophrenia, where you hear hallucinations and you have disordered thinking. And really the core of psychosis is irrational. So people who are psychotic are irrational through no fault of their own. So they cannot differentiate reality from delusion. And psychosis, for example, in the case of schizophrenia, is an eligible condition for insanity. So anyone recognize the woman on the left? I know we have a lot of people from Oregon, so they might recognize this as Diane Downs, a notorious serial killer right? She has had no history of a formal psychiatric illness. She was not schizophrenic or anything like that. And she shot 3 of her children, killing 1. And then she shot herself and drove to the ER and told the ER doctor, I was carjacked by a stranger. And at first they believed her, but eventually one of the surviving children told people what had happened. Essentially, Diana Downs was having an affair with a married man named RK. And this married man told her that he didn't want to be dating someone who had children. So Diane Downs thought that the most rational thing to do in that case, because she really wanted to date this person, was to shoot and murder her own children. Downs shot her children to be free of them so she could continue her affair with RK, who didn't want to have children in his life. And she was convicted of murder, rightfully so. Now, many of you might also recognize this woman here, right? And she has 5 children, all of whom she killed, unfortunately. So this is Andrea Yates. She had a long history of severe psychosis after delivering each of her children. She was hospitalized psychiatrically for that each time. And sure enough, after the birth of her 5th child, and it's this baby here in the 2000s, she became severely psychotic and she drowned all 5 children in her bathtub. And the defense expert that examined her, Phil Resnick, who's one of the top forensic psychiatrists in the country, if not the world, said Yates believed deeply that killing her children was the right thing to do. She believed that Satan had taken over her body and soul and was eyeing her children's soul next. She believed that if she killed her children while they were still innocent, they would be sent to heaven. And although she was initially convicted of murder, that first trial was thrown out for various reasons that are fascinating, but I won't go into. And on her retrial, she was found insane, which I think was the proper adjudication. Okay, so psychopaths are rational. People who are psychotic are irrational. They genuinely cannot. It's not that they will not differentiate reality from fantasy, that they cannot differentiate reality from fantasy. So reading about people like Ted Bundy and Diane Downs, you might be feeling a mixture of emotions, probably some negative emotions. You might be angry, you might be disgusted, you might be just kind of horrified or angry, right? And you might be thinking, how on earth can they do these things? So I want you to kind of just check in with yourselves and kind of just from a 0 to 100, how outraged are you about Ted Bundy and Diane Downs? And I want you to kind of remember that number because I'm going to ask you to check in on it as we go through the talk. Now, psychopathy, psychopaths have been described through the ages, and it starts with the Bible, right? I mean, probably even before the Bible, but the Bible had Cain, who is thought to be one of the earliest psychopaths in the literature. In the 1800s, a French psychiatrist named Philippe Pinel described it as maniaque sans délire, insanity without delirium, and his protege described it as la folie raisonnante, or rational madness. Benjamin Rush was a very prominent psychiatrist in the 1800s in the US, and he described it as psychopathy as a form of moral insanity. And Hervey Klecki, a famous psychopathy researcher in the 40s, wrote this book called The Mask of Sanity, basically saying, you know what, they're rational, they seem normal on the surface, but underneath the surface, they actually have this moral insanity. So it's this combination of intact cognitive, they're rational, but they're morally deranged. Now, this is Robert Hare. Robert Hare took psychopathy into the modern age. So before Robert Hare, psychopathy was just described with words like insanity without delirium or moral insanity. And that kind of makes sense and is understandable in an intuitive sense, but really it gets kind of squishy. And if you want to, launch a research project, it's hard to, you want to have a standardized set of criteria to define what a psychopath is. Robert Hare is the man that did that. He's a Canadian psychologist who did his early work in the Canadian prison system and interacted with lots of psychopaths. And over time, he said, I want a way to quantify, describe psychopathy and quantify how psychopathic someone is. So he developed a structured interview, hundreds of questions to ask these folks. And from these hundreds of questions, he developed this checklist of 20 items, and here are the 20 items, right? And for each of these items, based on the answers to the questions asked of them, you kind of took each item and scored it 0, meaning it wasn't relevant, 1 meaning it was kind of relevant, or 2 meaning that it was very relevant. So take a look at these 20 factors right now. This is what the modern definition of a psychopath is. It's some combination of these 20 factors as described by Robert Hare and codified in what's called the Hare psychopathy checklist. And I encourage you, while you do that, to sum up your knowledge of what you know about Donald Trump and just kind of see how well it matches up or doesn't match up. So, Hare divided these 20 items into 4 columns, basically calling them facets. So there's an interpersonal column, kind of describing the ways that psychopaths are deviant in their interpersonal relationships. So they're superficially charming, they're grandiose, selfish, egocentric, they're pathological liars, they're very conning and manipulative. Con man, the classic con man, is a psychopath, right? And they also have these affective or emotional problems, right? They lack remorse. Famous psychiatrist once called psychopaths emptied souls. So they lack remorse. They have a shallow affect, meaning that they don't have emotional depth, right? They seem to lack empathy, and they constantly blame others. And then, they live this kind of lifestyle where they constantly need stimulation. They're parasitic. They kind of always live off others, promiscuous. They lack realistic long-term goals. They're impulsive and irresponsible. And then there's just flagrant antisocial behaviors or criminal behaviors. Poor behavioral controls, I think, means like they get angry very easily and kind of fly off the handle. The problems start early with early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency. They're in and out of prison a lot, and they're criminally versatile. Like they do lots of different kinds of crimes, and they're engaged in many short-term relationships. Now, you take these 20 items, you score them 0, 1, or 2, and you add them all up. The total score would be 40. So someone who is super, severe in every one of these facets or parameters would score a 40. Remember, Ted Bundy scored 39 out of 40, so he got pretty close. And there was a cutoff. Hare said, basically, if you score over 30, you are a psychopath by my definition. Now, when you define psychopathy like that, it's nice because it's reproducible, it's standardized. So then you can start running lots of studies, right? And then compare one study to another. If everyone before, Hare had a different definition of what a psychopath is, then you can't compare studies, right? So by standardizing what psychopathy meant, you could now run these rigorous studies. And it turns out psychopaths represent 1% of the male population over 18. But they're between 15 and 25% of male prisoners, right? So basically, there are a lot more. This 1% makes up about 1/5 of all prisoners in the United States, at least. And most of those prisoners are in there for violent offenses. They're kind of sweet talking, right? So they're charming and glib. So they have this facility with language. So they're more likely to be early released. They can sweet talk the parole board, right? But they're also a lot more likely to recidivate, right? So basically, as soon as they're released early, they'll often commit a crime immediately and go right back into prison. So because of that, there's this 3-to-1 cycling. Compared to a non-psychopath in prison, a psychopathic prisoner will be in and out 3 times for every 1 time a non-psychopathic prisoner goes in and out. And because of this, it's estimated that they commit 50% of all violent crimes. I'm very impressed by these statistics. I'm going to show it to you visually. So again, psychopaths represent 1% of the general male population, but they are 20% of male prisoners. And because there is so much cycling in and out, because they leave the prison and they come right back because they just commit a new crime immediately. They go in and out 3 times more often than a non-psychopathic prisoner. And because of that, this 1% of the general male population is thought to commit half of all violent crimes. That's a truly staggering number, right? Because the cost of crime is estimated in 2009 to cost society, just in the United States, the total cost of crime in the United States in 2009, it was estimated to be $2.3 trillion. And if psychopaths are committing a significant fraction of those crimes, it's a staggering amount of money that psychopathy is costing society. And just as a comparison, the cost of healthcare in the United States for that year was $2.5 trillion. So it's roughly the same amount we spend on healthcare is what psychopaths cost us, or total crime costs us as a society, of which psychopaths might be up to half of that. Okay, so here's the psychopathy checklist. These are the things that Robert Hare quantifies in his psychopaths, and it describes kind of a well-formed psychopath, right? But really, kind of an interesting question is, how did the psychopath become a psychopath? How did they get to be how they were? So if you turn back the clock, maybe when they were an adolescent, were they like a little bit psychopathic? And then, when they were, just a baby, are psychopaths born, right? Or are they made, or, this is, this is my baby Dean. He's actually 3 now, but this is when he was a baby. And I don't think he's a psychopath, but he is a royalty-free image. So I'm going to use my children as much as possible. But can are psychopaths basically, do they start off as pretty intact babies, but through a horrible environment maybe turn into a psychopath? Or a psychopath born with inborn predispositions that make them into an adult psychopath? This is an interesting question that we will be exploring for much of this talk. So here's the psychopathy checklist, and I'm going to rearrange things a bit to make it a bit more, make it more sense from a neuroscience point of view. Okay, so the categories I have that are kind of neuroscience informed are a bunch of these things about psychopaths have to do with impaired emotional processing, lacking empathy, needing constant stimulation, kind of not learning from their mistakes and making the same mistakes over and over again, having a shallow affect and lacking remorse. These are all can be described by certain brain impairments that affect emotional processing. Same with impulsivity. Impulsivity is quite well known in terms of its neurobiology. And so, if your brain is set up to be impulsive, it's going to make you promiscuous and lacking long-term goals. And you're going to have, you're going to fly off the handle really easily, and you're going to be in and out lots of relationships. Deceit has also been well described from a neuroscience standpoint. And psychopaths have the equipment neurobiologically to be excellent liars. And remember, the thing about psychopaths is like they have these emotional problems and they're highly impulsive and they constantly lie, but they are still rational. They have intact cognition, right? And then, there's an early onset, right? Early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency, right? And then all these things lead to the criminal behaviors that eventually follow. So what I'm saying is these things that are blue, right? So the early onset, that's a clue that there might be something biological or genetic going on, right? Because if it happens early, then there's less time for the environment to have influenced what you've turned into, right? And this combination of emotional processing issues with an intact cognition, I would argue is the core of what psychopathy means from a neurological basis. So they're rational, but they're morally deranged. And because of that, they are more likely to commit crimes. Now, it turns out that psychopaths are also well-equipped neurobiologically to be very deceitful, and we'll talk about that. And of course, being very deceitful also predisposes you to criminal and antisocial behaviors. And we'll also talk about some of the affective machinery that makes people more impulsive. And people who are more impulsive tend to commit more crimes. Okay, so there has been a lot of evidence that's accumulated. And what's really interesting about the neuroscience of psychopathy is that it's really when you uncover the hood of what's happening, inside a psychopath's head, it turns out that a lot of it is quite biological. And there's a strong biological basis of psychopathy. And some of the evidence of this is that many psychopaths come from intact backgrounds where there was no discernible neglect or abuse. And in fact, early studies by Robert Hare indicated that when you compare psychopathic criminals to non-psychopathic criminals, there's no consistent difference in family backgrounds. The story is a bit more complicated though, because later studies that Hare did showed that actually there is some environmental influence, that psychopaths that come from a low socioeconomic status have a more severe form of psychopathy as adults. So there is environmental influence. Twin studies are the strongest piece of evidence that there's a strong biological basis of psychopathy. The traits, as we described, are apparent in early childhood, and the brain differences can be seen from an early age. This all adds up to being highly indicative that psychopathy has a strong biological/genetic basis. And so what I'm arguing is psychopaths in general tend to have genes that set up their brain in a way to be more psychopathic. And that brain, as it grows up, interacts with the environment and eventually turns you into a criminal psychopath. And we'll talk more about this. So here's the twin study from 2005 that basically showed that psychopathy is highly genetic. So basically, the study compared fraternal twins with identical twins. So you guys probably know this, but identical twins start from one fertilized egg that through a freak accident, right, So this fertilized egg splits into two, and because of a freak accident, then this fertilized egg kind of with two cells splits into two identical fertilized eggs, essentially. So identical twins share the exact same genetic material. And basically, they found that if one twin pair has psychopathic traits, it's highly likely that the other twin will also have psychopathic traits. And when you compare that with fraternal twins, twins that often grow up in the same environment but only share half their genetic material, the effect is mitigated. So if one of the twin pair is a psychopath, it's only slightly more likely that the other twin, the fraternal twin, will be a psychopath. So this study basically calculated that about 67% of psychopathic traits are heritable, meaning that they're genetically encoded. And there's lots of case studies and case reports about very young children who are highly emotionally disturbed. And we don't call these young children psychopaths because it's quite pejorative and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So researchers call these young children youths with callous unemotional traits. So Paul Frick, who works with these children, described one boy who used a knife to cut off the tail of the family cat bit by bit over a period of weeks. The boy was proud of the serial amputations, which his parents initially failed to notice. When we talked about it, he was very straightforward, Frick recalls. He said, "I want to be a scientist, and I was experimenting. I wanted to see how the cat would react." Well, that's an admirable scientific attitude, but how many among you could truly do that to your cat? To actually cut the tail off bit by bit and see the cat suffering and still continue because you just want to see how the cat would react, right? So if our crowd tonight is about 700 and about 1% are psychopathic, there are 7 of you that might be able to do this. Okay, so this is the core problem of psychopathy from a neurobiological standpoint. They have emotional processing problems with an intact cognition. And so one of the earliest studies, so let's dive into this a bit more. So one of the earliest studies, this was back in 1957, basically said, psychopaths seem to be different than other people. They seem less anxious, they have a lower heart rate, and when you stress them out by giving them electrical shocks, they don't respond as much. They seem to be more insensitive to pain, and they just get less stressed from those kind of painful stimuli. They also have impaired learning. So impaired fear conditioning, things like, most of us, if we touch a hot stove, we make that association immediately and we don't touch that hot stove again. But you know what? Psychopaths will touch a hot stove over and over again. They seem like to not get it at a kind of core neurobiological circuit level. And they have impaired punishment learning. They don't learn from punishment. Right? You could punish a psychopath up the wazoo over and over again. And for most people who are not psychopaths, they get it. They say, I don't want to feel pain. I associate doing this with feeling pain, so I'm not going to do that thing anymore. But psychopaths seem to not get that. They have impaired punishment learning. And because of this, they're more likely to recidivate, right? So if you don't learn from your errors, and going to prison is pretty painful, I would imagine, for most people. Most people would not want to do that thing again to go back to prison. But psychopaths don't learn from their mistakes. All of this, less anxious, lower heart rate, lower stress response, all points to having an impaired amygdala. So let's talk about that. Most of you, and this is probably a science-savvy audience, know about the amygdala. It's like ground zero for emotions. So let me tell you a story. Imagine you are sitting back on a nice, spring day. You're just enjoying the sunshine on your face, and you're daydreaming, about, various fantasies. Maybe you're kind of daydreaming about climbing up the corporate ladder. Maybe you're daydreaming about asking out that cute barista, for a date. And life is good. And there's a nice little kind of breeze on your arm, and you're feeling so relaxed. And then you kind of notice the breeze isn't all over your arm. It's just kind of in one spot on your arm. And then actually the breeze doesn't feel like a breeze. It actually feels like little legs crawling on you. You look down and you see this, right? So suddenly your brain snapped from a daydreaming state to a state of high alert. That was caused because the amygdala in your brain sounded the alarm. So the amygdala this is your brain. This is the temporal lobe of your brain. And the amygdala is right here. It's an almond-shaped nucleus. Amygdala comes from the Latin root almond. And it's right in front of the hippocampus, which is our main memory structure in our brain. So, the amygdala, is sort of our fear center. And that's an oversimplification, but it's true to a first approximation, that when you feel fear or kind of some sense of threat, your amygdala gets highly active. And it's interesting that it's right next to the memory center because fear, right? Fear really helps you remember things, doesn't it, right? And any of you guys remember cramming for finals week? And right, you remember stuff pretty well when you're kind of really a bit scared, right? So the amygdala, we've known about the amygdala for a long time. We had these poor monkeys back in the 1930s. They did this experiments where they took out the temporal lobes in monkeys, which include the amygdala. And basically, they noticed profound personality changes in these monkeys to the point where they did not seem to feel fear. So here's a monkey approaching, this is a rubber snake, but it's highly unusual for a monkey to reach out and grab a snake. That's highly unusual behavior. This is because this monkey no longer has a fear center in its brain. Right, and we know from fMRI studies to look at brain activation that when you look at fearful faces, your amygdala activate. So one key thing to understand about the brain is that it's hierarchically organized. You're not aware of most of the things your own brain is doing. You're only aware of a tiny fraction of what your brain is doing, things that you're paying attention to and things that you have access to. So for instance, your brain is constantly monitoring the level of oxygen in your brain, in your bloodstream, right? But you have no conscious access to what your oxygen level is in your bloodstream. But you know who does have access to that information? Your amygdala. So I described the amygdala as a yappy chihuahua, and I'll get to that in a minute. But your amygdala is like this low-level employee who's constantly working, whether you're paying attention or not. It's constantly scanning the entire environment, things outside your world, things inside your body. It's scanning it all to be able to detect things that might be threatening to your survival, and then to pull the alarm. So the amygdala is a highly connected structure. Everything, basically, this is a diagram of brain connectivity, and the amygdala is in the center. And these are all the different brain areas your amygdala is connected to. Basically, everything feeds into the amygdala, and the amygdala in turn feeds into many brain areas. So it senses a lot of information, and then it can do a lot of things in your brain. So the amygdala is like a yappy chihuahua that's constantly scanning the environment. And it's getting signals from the visual system, the auditory system, tactile, your skin, right? The olfactory system, stuff inside your body, the visceral system, right? And then when something like a spider crawls in your arm, right? It says, you know what, this is something that you really need to pay attention to. Stop daydreaming, right? And so there's this amazing thing where the amygdala can then amplify the inputs that it thinks are the most salient, right? To really kind of hone in on, so from that, oh, there's a breeze in my arm. Oh, there's a kind of, that feels like legs, huh? So suddenly your visual system and your tactile system have really kicked into high drive. So your amygdala is behind that. And what does your amygdala do? It sounds the alarms, right? It signals your hypothalamus for physiological arousal, like to make your heart beat faster, get more blood pumping to your muscles. It activates the adrenaline and the cortisol endocrine system. It activates your hippocampus, so you start to remember things, because when you're under threat, that's a really good thing to remember so that you can avoid situations like that in the future. So your memory systems are activated, right? Lots of cognitive arousal systems in your brain are also activated, and it activates an aversive emotion in your body, right? It's this aversive emotion that makes you want to move away from whatever the thing is that's threatening. So that's what your amygdala does. But the thing about psychopaths is that they have smaller and less active amygdala. So instead of having a yappy chihuahua, they have some chihuahua that looks like this. And when your amygdala is not very active, it's sort of like there's a dimmer switch on all this stuff. It's like an emotional dimmer switch where they're just not sensing emotions or threats around it or pain, things like that as vividly, right? So they're less anxious and they have less fear, right? When your amygdala is not very active, you're not really, it's sounding, the alarm systems are very low, right? So you're constantly bored, right? That's why, this need for stimulation is one of the characteristics of psychopaths. And it's also why they use drugs a lot, because they're looking for that sensation, right? And it also explains impaired punishment learning. Let's get into that now. So key deficit for psychopathy is impaired punishment learning. They don't learn from painful mistakes. So again, here's my baby Dean, right? And Dean, he can be a very sweet baby, and we love him very much. And I want to reiterate, I don't think he's a psychopath, but baby Dean has a dark side, right? So when he was little, he beat us on a regular basis. And so what happens, most of us who raise kids understand that toddlers are they're like little savages. They can kick and bite and scream and, be quite violent with each other. right? But eventually we kind of civilize them over time. And how do we do that? We do that with negative feedback, right? So, some figure steps in, says, don't do that. It makes you feel really bad in your body, right? So this is what's happening in your brain, right? So here's the amygdala, right? And here's another part of the brain, which I'm going to introduce, called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And these two structures are connected by a fiber bundle called the uncinate fasciculus. Basically, when inside the brain of, let's say you're inside of this kid's brain, this kid just scratched the other kid, and mama said, don't do that, and said it in a harsh tone of voice that made the baby realize that was a bad thing to do. The amygdala activates and registers an aversive emotion. That aversive emotion, right, and then it's the amygdala sends that signal to the VMPFC, which understands the context. I scratched my brother. And so this combination of the aversive emotion and this context is stored as an emotional memory. So it's mama in the cookie jar. The reason you don't keep reaching for the cookie jar is because the first few times you did it, you got a slap on the wrist, you registered an aversive emotion associated with the context. I got cookies when I shouldn't have, right? So you do that over and over again. You store a bunch of these emotional memories, right? Or these emotional linkages that build up over time and become the basis of what I call moral autopilot, right? So there's kind of this database of things that you did that made you feel bad, right? And so the amazing thing is the VMPFC not only stores these kind of emotional linkages, it can predict when a bad thing is going to happen and start to play that emotion again so that you don't do that thing again. So, most of you, you can turn to if you're, when I give this talk in a theater, this is a lot easier, but turn to the person next to you, right? And imagine taking your hands and strangling the life out of them while you see the light go out in their eyes, right? Now, most of you could not do that under any circumstance because you have such strong training over time with this kind of all these emotional linkages with violence that, connected with this bad feeling in your body, that even when you contemplate doing stuff like that, the VMPFC says, oh, wait, there's something you should know. Let me replay you this emotional memory that I think is relevant in this situation. And then you start to feel this bad feeling in your body again, which makes you not want to do that thing, right? So you can see how this kind of database of emotional linkages that get automatically replayed in the appropriate context can form the basis of this moral autopilot, right? This thing that makes you, we don't strangle people. You don't have to think to yourself, should I strangle people or not? You don't have to think about that. It's all kind of emotional and automatic that happens underneath the surface, right? And kind of storing these emotional linkages to aversive experiences is the basis of punishment learning, right? The reason we don't do things over and over again, that made us feel bad is because we don't want to feel bad again, right? Now, it's interesting. Psychopaths have smaller amygdala and they're more underactive. We talked about that, right? But their VMPFC is also less active and smaller. So psychopaths are less able to store aversive emotional memories. So they don't learn from punishment and they don't develop social inhibitions. They don't develop that kind of database of emotional linkages, right? It just, that emotional memory system is just defective. So they don't have this moral autopilot, which is why direct deterrence doesn't work, and they don't learn from their painful mistakes and they recidivate frequently. Now, with regards to Trump, what if you never got punished? So, I don't know what Trump's amygdala is like. Maybe his amygdala is working just fine, but maybe the reason he doesn't have emotional linkages to, to things that most of us would feel shameful about is because maybe he just wasn't punished when he, on a regular basis when he was growing up. So, one of the books I read, in preparing for this talk is this book by Mary Trump, who is a niece of Donald Trump. And I found her accounts very relevant because she has firsthand knowledge of what this family was like growing up, right? So she wrote, at an early age, Donald began to realize that there was nothing he could do wrong. So he stopped trying to do anything right. He became bolder and more aggressive because he was rarely challenged or held to account by the only person in the world who mattered, his father. Fred liked his killer attitude. So his father actually encouraged kind of this aggression in Donald because he liked his killer attitude, even if it manifested as bad behavior. Every one of Donald's transgressions became an audition for his father's favor, as if he was saying, see, Dad, I'm the tough one. I'm the killer. Now, again, I'm not offering a professional opinion. I'm not offering a diagnosis that Donald Trump is a psychopath, but, and I don't know whether Mary Trump's account is true. I think she's credible, right? Why would she lie? But, that's a diagnosis would kind of depend on all these things. But if this account is true and Donald Trump was not punished on a regular basis for being highly aggressive, you could see why he would continue to be highly aggressive as an adult, right? It's not rocket science. So Robert Hare described this kind of 20 factors that make up a psychopath, but if you could describe it in one phrase, it's basically, and he wrote this book called Without Conscience. So what is a psychopath? It's this complicated set of 20 factors, or stated simply, you can say a psychopath is someone who is without conscience. But what is the conscience, right? Now, the fascinating thing is we know a lot about how the conscience is instantiated by brain activity because of this wonderful machine called an MRI that can, with the fMRI, we can scan brain activity. And so there are actually 4 different literatures that all point to this structure, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So here's the brain, and the medial, the brain has 2 halves, and so there's a medial surface to the brain. So ventral means underneath, and medial means in the middle, right? So this ventral medial prefrontal cortex, here's another view of it, right, is really ground central for the conscience. Without a ventral medial prefrontal cortex, you cannot have a conscience. And the literatures that all point, separate literatures that all point to this structure as being a critical brain structure for the conscience. There's a whole literature about moral reasoning. So when you kind of solve moral dilemmas, this part of your brain is highly active, and we'll talk about that. The psychopathic literature, Ken Keel and R.J.R. Blair, I had to kind of have really fleshed out that this is a structure that's highly defective in psychopaths. And I recently had the pleasure of meeting R.J.R. Blair, and I invited him to his talk. So he might be out there listening to this talk. And if he is, I'm honored to have you. The traumatic brain injury literature, people who have had this part of their brain damaged, so Phineas Gage, many of you guys know Phineas Gage, the railroad foreman who had a tamping iron kind of that went through his brain and damaged this area, which basically turns people into instant psychopaths. And then there's a dementia literature. There's slowly dementing conditions like frontal temporal dementia, which affects this brain area, and people become immoral over time. So let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience of moral decision making. And the main person who does this is Josh Green, who basically sticks people in scanners and gives them moral dilemmas. And then he looks at their brain activity to figure out which parts of the brain are important to solve moral dilemmas. So let me pose a few moral dilemmas to you. So I'm going to pose the dilemma. I'm going to say, is it appropriate to, and I'm going to finish the phrase. And then, basically, I want you to really decide whether it's appropriate to do whatever I'm asking you to do, okay? So let's start with an easy one. Is it appropriate for you to destroy the sculpture in order to save this workman's life? There's a sculpture over a bridge and there's a trolley coming about to kill this person. So is it appropriate for you to push the sculpture over to save the workman's life? Now, let's make the same situation, but instead of having to push a sculpture, you have to push a person. So you kill one person, but you do it in order to save 5 people. Is it appropriate for you to push the stranger onto the tracks in order to save the 5 workmen? Crying baby. So let's say you're a Jewish family hiding in the basement from Nazi soldiers who are overhead, right? And you all have to be super quiet or else the Nazi soldiers will find you and kill you all. And your baby starts to cry and you cannot shut this baby up. Right? So, and if the baby is hurt by the Nazi soldiers, the baby will be killed, and all the other people will be killed. So is it appropriate for you to smother your child in order to save yourself and the other townspeople? So note that, if you don't smother your child, your baby's going to cry and everyone's going to die, including the baby. But if you do smother your child, you have a chance of saving everyone else. At this point, you're probably wondering, boy, this is science on tap. I'm supposed to be drinking a beer and having fun. What the heck am I doing here? It gets better, I promise you. So some of these moral dilemmas were harder than others. And there's some that I didn't mention here. And if you had to rank which ones were harder and easier, I would imagine most of you found it pretty easy to decide whether to push the sculpture off. That's a no-brainer, right? Push the sculpture off, save a person. Probably many people found it harder to push a person off, right, to save 5 people. And then the hardest thing would be to smother your own baby for a good cause, to save everyone else. But how many of you could really do that? Could really smother your own baby, even if it meant you could save everyone else, including, So, the harder moral dilemmas elicit this sense of horror, right? The sense that you're going to harm someone. And we have this automatic feeling of horror in contemplating that. Most of us who are non-psychopaths have that, but psychopaths do not have that sense of horror. And why is that? Well, okay, so, these moral dilemmas were difficult. The crying baby, the pushing the person, right? Because there's a conflict in your brain. There's a conflict between the reasoning part of your brain that says, you know what? you know, the math works out. You kill one person, save 5. But then there's this horror part of your brain that says, you know what? I don't know if I could do it. I don't know if I could really push that person over the bridge, right? Something's stopping you, right? And that conflict is played out in your brain. So Josh Green, by sticking people in scanners while solving moral dilemmas like the crying baby dilemma, basically found that there are 2 separate systems in the brain. One system is anchored by the DLPFC, which is a brain area that is involved in abstract reasoning. And the brain, you know, there are always brain circuits that do there's a whole circuit that does abstract reasoning, but the DLPFC is a critical area that anchors that whole rational reasoning circuit. And then in contrast, there's another circuit that does emotional reasoning, right? And that's anchored by the VMPFC that can process the social context and then generate an aversive emotion, the sense of horror. Right, so, you know, in these kind of, you know, the crying baby example, right, the math works out. The abstract reasoning part of your brain says, you know what, I kill one baby, but I save everyone else, right? Otherwise, everyone dies, right? So the math works out to go ahead and smother that baby. So the reasoning part of your brain, right, saying go, but the social emotion part of your brain, right, saying, no, I don't think I could do that. That just feels too horrible, right? And then every time there's a conflict between two competing goals, the ACC snaps into place. The ACC is sort of like a CEO in your brain, a very high level executive in your brain that gets consulted when the lower levels of the brain are having a conflict. And the ACC tries to solve that conflict by saying either do it or don't do it. So it's reasons versus emotions, right? And, you know, for a lot of us, no matter how strong the reasons are, our emotions stop us. So even if there were 100 people in that basement, right? So, and if you killed your own baby, you could save 100 people, right? Most of us still probably couldn't do it because the sense of horror is such a strong stop signal. But, you know, psychopaths, it's interesting, have defective VMPFCs, right? So, you know, this area of the brain isn't quite as active. So they feel less of a sense of horror, right? Meaning that the stop signal is less intense. Meaning that for psychopaths, if you ask a psychopath what they're going to do in that situation, they're going to say, I'm going to smother the baby. And why is everyone so upset at me? It just makes sense. So the VMPFC is a key area for the conscience. And I would argue that the conscience is composed of 3 different functions that the VMPFC participates in. One is social inhibitions, which we've talked about already, right? Kind of like this, you know, the storing of emotional aversive linkages, mama and the cookie jar, right? But the other components are empathy and impulse control. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the VMPFC is a key area for empathy. And what is empathy? Empathy is a kind of imagination, right? It's the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. It's the foundation of pro-social behavior. And it's thought to be an evolutionary benefit because, you know, it turns out that when we were out on the African savannah, it made sense to team up with other people that helped us survive. And having empathy was sort of like a social glue that helped people live in large groups. And empathy is actually a kind of imagination. So think about what imagination is. And, you know, I was an avid reader when I was young, and I still read when I can, but, you know, I just love picking up a book and, you know, from a one-dimensional stream of text that entering my brain, it ignited this whole universe, a whole world, right? A world full of sounds and images and thoughts and feelings, right? And the thing is, you know, we all have this imagination engine in our head, right? So this imagination engine, you know, when you look at it neurobiologically, it's a set of interconnected brain areas that all kind of participate in a circuit to create virtual simulations. So all of us can think back to an emotional day in our lives, you know, the day we got married, the day our first, you know, child was born, maybe the day we got divorced, right? Any kind of emotionally significant experience, you know, you could really close your eyes and relive that entire experience, right? With sights and sounds, thoughts and feelings, and you know, we can also simulate how other people might feel, right? So, you know, what are these brain areas? So, you know, there's the hippocampus, right, which is, you know, important for memory, and memory forms the building blocks for imagination, right? And then there's a part of the brain called the DMPFC, or the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, that helps us understand what other people might be thinking, right? So, when you think about like, the prospect of going to your boss and asking for a raise, you can have that entire conversation in your head. You know what your boss is gonna, you know what you're gonna say, then you can predict what your boss is gonna say. That's your DMPFC kind of calculating what other people might be thinking. It's this skill called mentalization that psychologists are very familiar with, right? So the VMPFC, on the other hand, right, the structure we've been talking about so much, helps us to understand what other people might be feeling, right? It's the basis for empathy. So when someone is feeling something, right, we automatically can feel what they're feeling, right? So the VMPFC helps us kind of attune to other people's feelings. Now, psychopaths have intact DMPFCs, so they're able to mentalize just fine, right? So they're really good at lying and manipulation, but their VMPFC is less active, right, and defective. So they have impaired empathy. For them, other people are like just like objects. They're not people, right? So a famous psychopathy researcher said, psychopaths know the words, but not the music. Now, empathy is also the basis for vicarious learning. So I'm going to date myself again, but many of you probably, some of you, if you're over 40, you recognize who this person is, right? And you recognize what movie this comes from. This is Glenn Close from Fatal Attraction, right? And what's the moral of this story? Basically, don't cheat on your wife. Do not cheat on your wife, right? And and how did it teach you not to cheat on your wife? Did it show you an Excel spreadsheet showing you like all the reasons you shouldn't cheat on your wife? No, right? You learned that lesson by feeling horrible, right? Because Michael Douglas was feeling the sense of horror as this woman kind of stalked him and kind of killed his rabbit and did all these horrible things. And you just felt like, oh my God, I feel horrible. You empathized with Michael Douglas and you said, you know what? I don't want to be like Michael Douglas, so I'm not going to cheat on my wife. And I bet if you graphed like infidelity levels for 6 weeks after this movie, I bet you there was a sharp drop in infidelity for at least for a while after this movie. So this is what's called indirect deterrence or vicarious experience. We can learn from other people's mistakes. We don't have to experience those mistakes. But again, if psychopaths have defects in experiencing these emotions and learning from other people's emotions, right? Again, they're not going to learn from other people's mistakes. So again, this is another factor that makes them recidivate. This is why they don't learn. They don't learn from their own mistakes. That's the direct deterrence. And they don't learn from other people's mistakes. That's indirect deterrence. And with regards for empathy, I thought this was Trump has made quite clear that empathy is for suckers, right? And I thought this passage from Mary Trump's book was quite interesting. So she describes basically, when she was younger, her dad, Donald Trump's older brother, was hospitalized after a very significant heart attack. And basically, the family was gathered in the house, and everyone knew that the father's situation was grave, right? And what did Donald Trump do that night? He went to the movies, right? And later that night, the hospital called the family saying that the dad was dead. So, I think this is an interesting anecdote. Your oldest brother is in the hospital, almost certain to die. And what you choose to do is not go to the hospital and visit him, but instead go to the movies. So you can draw your own conclusions about Trump and empathy. Okay, so let's talk about impulse control, right? So we talked about the amygdala, right? So the amygdala is like this yappy little chihuahua that's constantly, scanning the environment for things that might threaten you, right? So it's your monster detector, right? But then there's another part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens that is sort of like the opposite of the amygdala. Your nucleus accumbens is it's a happy little puppy that's constantly looking for things that might bring you pleasure, right? And it's your donut detector. So when your amygdala finds things that are threatening, it activates and it generates an aversive emotion that makes you want to move away from that thing. When your nucleus accumbens activates, it generates this attraction, this kind of feeling like you want to move towards that object, right? So the amygdala is your monster detector, your nucleus accumbens is your donut detector. Right. Now, the thing is, though, that, we don't run away from every monster and we don't, go for every donut that we see. Why is that? Because the activity of these low-level brain areas, which comprise your low-level impulses or drives, we don't follow through in every drive that we have, right? And why is that? It's because both these structures are connected to the VMPFC, which is sort of like the dog walker in this case, or the executive. So the VMPFC is an intelligent part of your brain that provides contextual understanding, right? So your amygdala might say, oh my gosh, I see a snake, I'm gonna activate, and tells the VMPFC, right? And the VMPFC says, okay, thank you, amygdala. Thank you for telling me that the snake there, but you know what? I have additional information. I know I'm in a zoo and I see that that snake is behind glass in a cage. So you know what, amygdala, you need to chill out, right? So the VMPFC interprets the data coming from the amygdala and nucleus accumbens, right? And determines whether to follow through on it or not. And the reason the VMPFC is so intelligent is because it's connected to other brain areas. It's connected to the hippocampus and all the memories you might have about certain things. It's connected to the reasoning part of your brains. It's connected to this whole database of emotional linkages that you made growing up. So it can make wise decisions. It doesn't have to just follow everything that your amygdala and your nucleus accumbens is telling it to do. Now, one interesting thing that we've learned is that, your brain maturation takes a really long time. So we used to think that the brain was mature at an early age. And so this is a famous graph from age 5 to age 20. Blue means mature and red means immature. And you can see the videos here of how kind of the back areas of your brain mature first. And then that maturity the frontal lobes actually mature last. So actually this VMPFC, which is located in the front of your brain, is one of the last areas to mature. So take a baby. Babies have very immature VMPFCs, right? So they run away from every monster, and they can't keep away from every donut, right? So they're highly impulsive. They're basically slaves to their drives because they don't have a well-formed executive yet, right? They just kind of do whatever their amygdala or nucleus accumbens is saying. Now, as teenagers are a little bit better, right? But they're still impulsive, right? Because this area of the brain is still not quite developed, right? And interestingly, when you look at psychopaths, what we said about the amygdala is that their amygdala, instead of a yappy chihuahua, is kind of like their chihuahua is asleep at the wheel, right? So basically, their monster detector is not working very well, right? So that's why they're fearless, right? On the other hand, and I know R.J. Blair, if you're out there, he's done a lot of research that shows that contradicts this, but so the literature is complicated, but there's at least some literature that shows that people who are psychopathic have very overly active nucleus accumbens. So donuts look super good to them, right? So they're highly hedonic, meaning that they really go for immediate gratification. So when you consider that, psychopaths have an underdeveloped VMPFC and they have a underactive amygdala, so they're fearless, and an overactive nucleus accumbens, that's a bad combination, right? If you're fearless, hedonic, and have a poorly formed executive, then you're a highly impulsive person. And I'll just let you judge for yourself where you think Trump fits on the spectrum of impulsivity. Okay. So let's talk about, so we talked about, the core deficit, I believe, in psychopathy from a neurobiological standpoint is that they have a deranged emotional processing, but an intact cognition, right? So their emotional processing is deranged in various ways. Their amygdala, right, is less active. Their VMPFC is less active and atrophied. So they're less able to do punishment learning. The VMPFC is also involved in empathy, and in psychopaths, their VMPFC does not work very well, so they have less empathy. And finally, the VMPFC is involved in impulse control, right? So they have less impulse control. Also, they're fearless and they're highly hedonic, right? So that explains a lot of what's on the psychopathy checklist, right? And they have intact cognition, right? So they can still manipulate and con people really well. I want to talk briefly about this, and I know this is about a little bit over. If you can indulge me, this is such a fascinating thing about psychopaths and being pathological liars. You guys remember this? At Trump's inauguration, January 20th, 2007, these are kind of crowd sizes of Obama and Trump. And the next day, Sean Spicer, no doubt at the direction of Donald Trump, said that was the largest audience to witness an inauguration, period. And this is just the start of, this seems like a million years ago. For most of us, this was like, what the hell's going on here? Like, why would Trump lie about something so objectively, verifiably false, right? It was just puzzling, right? And since then, I just want to say this anecdote too, So one thing about psychopaths is they're kind of superficially charming. And so it takes a little bit while, when you first meet a psychopath, you might be really taken by them. You might think, oh, that's a really great person. But who knows psychopaths really well are the people who, so the people closest to the psychopath, right? If you spend time with a psychopath, it eventually becomes obvious that, oh, this is all an act. They're actually this kind of cold-blooded person inside. And so, I thought it was interesting that Mary Trump's reaction to election night, was basically, at 5 o'clock the next morning, when Trump was announced the winner, I was wandering around my house as traumatized as many other people, but in a more personal way. It felt as though 62 million voters had chosen to turn this country into a macro version of my malignantly dysfunctional family. So this kind of inauguration claim was, for most of us, it was new. It's like, wow, I've never thought like a president would lie so blatantly, so verifiably false too. It's bizarre, right? But these poor people who keep track of how many lies Trump has told, right? The Washington Post had an article, July 13th, 2020. That's 1,270 days since inauguration. At that point, he had told 20,000 false or misleading claims, and they've accelerated. The first 10,000 false and misleading claims took 827 days, but the next 10,000 took only 400 days. This is interesting. This is a speech from one of his recent rallies that was fact-checked by the New York Times, and everything he read was basically a lie, right? So in 90 minutes, President Trump made 131 false or inaccurate statements. There is this phenomenon called pseudologia fantastica, which is not officially a psychiatric diagnosis yet. It's more a collection of fascinating cases of people who lie apparently for no reason, right? So pseudologia fantastica describe patients who tell complex tales where delusions seem to coexist with lies. And these are the key characteristics. Chronic lying, and I encourage you to think about Donald Trump and see how well he matches this. Chronic lying or storytelling that is unrelated to or out of proportion to any clear benefit. These people lie for apparently no reason, right? Lie when they don't need to. Lie when it's objectively false. Qualitatively, the stories are dramatic, detailed, complicated, colorful, and fantastic. The stories typically feature the pseudologue as the hero or victim and seem geared to achieve acceptance, admiration, and sympathy, right? And in terms of insight, the key is these people are not psychotic. They are not totally delusional in the psychotic sense of they cannot differentiate reality from delusion. It's more like they believe what they're saying so much that they seem like I would call it pseudo delusional, right? They can fact check themselves and they can step back and say, oh, that's not true. But they seem to believe their lies so convincingly that they almost convince themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the neurobiology of deception. Here's old school lie detection. In ancient China, it was common practice to have an accused person chew a handful of dry rice and then attempt to spit it out. If the rice became wet and therefore easy to spit out, the person was considered truthful. If the gods made the rice dry and stuck to the suspect's mouth when he tried to spit it out, then he was thought to be lying. Does this make sense at all? Or is this total BS? It kind of makes sense, right? Because most people, when they lie, they feel nervous, right? And when you feel nervous, your sympathetic nervous system is active and your mouth becomes more dry, right? So this is basically, this kind of dry rice test is basically a test to see how anxious you are, right? And how is anxiety encoded in the brain? What's ground central for anxiety? You got it, the amygdala, right? So we can already see if a psychopath has an underactive and atrophied amygdala and they don't experience fear the same way other people do, right? They're not going to be anxious when they lie, so they're going to be better liars. And it gets more complicated than that. When you think about what happens inside someone's head when they're lying, right? So there's an emotional aspect, like most people, not everyone, psychopaths don't, but most people feel anxious, right? Or they feel guilty or they feel excited, right? And then there's this cognitive component where it's like, to lie effectively, you have to inhibit telling the truth. You have to generate a story. You have to keep track of things with your memory. It's pretty hard. And then you have to act, right? You have to suppress whatever emotions you might be showing. You have to generate honest behaviors like looking into someone's eyes, right? So it's all this stuff needs to happen in your brain, right? Which is why it's hard to do, which is why, one of the oldest truth compelling technologies is to get someone drunk, because then your cortex goes offline and it's harder to do all these things, right? To make a long story short, so neuroscientists understand lying quite well right, at this point, because they stick people in scanners, right, and they make them lie, and they they figure out what parts of their brain are active. And I'm not going to go, there's not enough time, but this is like, kind of one diagram that shows areas that are active when you're lying, and this is the front of the brain. I just want you to notice that a lot of what's happening is in the front of the brain. You know, when people have studied pathological liars and found that actually, you know, there's more stuff at the front of their brain. They have more white matter. Pathological liars have more white matter in the front of the brain. And in a subsequent study, that white matter was shown to be in areas that are highly active in lying, right? So the idea is people who lie all the time are practicing lying all the time. They're building up this circuit of lying. Right? And that's what they're building up is their myelin. So the myelin connects different brain areas, right? And as you practice the circuit over and over again, the myelin gets thicker and that circuit becomes more robust, stronger, more efficiently activated. So, you know, one of the reasons that that psychopaths can lie so well is because they have little amygdala activity, so they don't experience fear, right? Which is what gives away lying for a lot of people. Another reason is because they practice so much that the lying circuits in their brain are super well developed, and that can be discerned by these structural studies that have looked at how much white matter is in the brains of pathological liars. I thought that was quite fascinating. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on legal implications. Basically, should we punish psychopaths? And the question basically is like, are psychopaths insane? And insanity basically is, you know, different from state to state, but basically it's you have a qualifying mental disorder, and because of that, you lack a societal capacity to appreciate right from wrong, or to control your behaviors. Interesting about psychopathy is I think every state has a specific psychopathy exclusion, basically saying like, you know what, psychopathy is not a qualifying mental disorder. But you know what, over time, we've thought a lot of different kinds of mental disorders. Used to be you're just a bad person, right? So epilepsy used to be like you're possessed by a demon, you're a bad person. But now we know it's a disease, it's an electrical storm in the brain. So as as society progresses, as scientific knowledge progresses, we often shift a lot of diseases like epilepsy, major depression, addiction, somewhat on this pathway too. Instead of just saying like you're a bad person for having this illness, it's seen more as disease. So people become more sympathetic. And basically, one of my predictions is as we know more about psychopathy, we tend to feel a bit more sympathetic, like maybe it's not all their fault in quite the same way as we thought before. And this is where I want you to check in, right? Think about Diane Downs, think about Ted Bundy, even think about Donald Trump, Does knowing about some of these neurobiological derangements make you a bit more sympathetic? When judges were presented cases of psychopaths with and without basically biological data, the sentence that they handed down was about a year less. So, when they were sentencing, and this is all mock trial, when they were sentencing people who appeared to be psychopaths, they got a 14-year sentence. When biological evidence was shown, the judge shaved about a year off. So it was a small effect, but it was a noticeable effect in being mitigating, essentially. Now, I want to spend the last few minutes about like what to do with psychopaths, right? So can psychopathy be treated? And again, the model was, right, psychopaths have these bad genes that sets up their brain with psychopathic tendencies. That brain interacts with society, right? Environmental influences. And somehow in that soup of environmental influences in the brain, sometimes a criminal psychopath is created. So let's just take this one by one. So if psychopathy is essentially a genetic condition, can we fix their genes? And we're getting better at gene therapy, taking out bad genes and sticking in good genes. But the problem is with psychopathy that there are dozens of genes involved, and we simply do not have we are nowhere near the technical know-how to simultaneously snip out dozens of bad genes and snip them back in. We don't even know what the genes are. There's some candidate genes that have been identified, but most of it is just a big mystery. So genetic approaches, can offer a complete cure at the root of the problem, but we're nowhere near the technical capacities to do it. Now, how about things that can influence the brain, right? So we are in the golden age of neuroscience. We're getting better and better at looking at brain structure. 100 years ago, if you wanted to look at the brain, you couldn't. You had to inject air into people's ventricles and see the air bubbles. Now, 100 years later, we have these wonderful MRI images of the brain. We're also getting better and better with PET and fMRI at looking at brain activity. And finally, the latest wave is we're getting it better and better at intervening and actually changing brain activity, right? So we are in the era of precision psychiatry where, so this is Helen Mayberg. She has pioneered the use of deep brain electrodes, stimulating electrodes that you insert into the brain. And she has, through very methodical and rigorous work, found a spot in the brain using very fancy techniques, the exact right spot in people's brains who suffer from major depression to stick in an electrode. When you turn the electrode on, it's virtually an instant cure for their depression. Obviously, sticking needles into people's brains is highly invasive, so this is going to be limited, right, to how many people can do it. I'm fortunate enough to be part of the interventional team at Stanford, which are using non-invasive methods to modulate brain activity. And I think some of my colleagues are out there in the audience and want to give a shout out to them. So transcranial magnetic stimulation, if you've not heard of it, is a breakthrough technology that can change brain activity, and we use it currently to treat depression. It's one of the most effective treatments for depression. And if you learn nothing else from this talk, other than if you know someone who's depressed and hasn't responded to medications, you should look into TMS. It's an office procedure. It's 30 sessions, but each session is only 3 to 10 minutes long. There's no cognitive impairment. There's virtually no side effects except for a 1 in 30,000 risk of seizure. So it's super duper rare. And in our clinic, about 2/3 of people who have failed medications get a lot better in terms of their depression. And when you look at research studies that use high dose TMS, people like Nolan Williams at Stanford, Nolan is able to induce a 90% remission rate in the most treatment-resistant depressive population that we have, people who failed ECT. So it's a remarkable, remarkable technology. And because TMS can be applied to different parts of the brain, and we know that different parts of the brain are responsible for empathy, we can turn up and down people's empathy with TMS non-invasively. And the next thing beyond TMS is focused ultrasound, where you can beam ultrasound beams into someone's brain. And at high doses, it can actually ablate tissue. It can actually remove tissue. But low doses, you can actually stimulate brain tissue in a very, very precise way. This is not in clinical use yet in terms of brain stimulation. It is being used by neurosurgeons to vaporize tiny bits of tissue instead of having to cut into people's skull. But it's not quite there for brain stimulation. But this is the future, focused ultrasound. We've gotten so good at modulating people's brains kind of in a very focused way that raises lots of ethical questions, right? And so do we want to go mucking around with people's brains, right? Really, I think the thing that's going to really limit using brain neuromodulation to change behaviors like psychopathy is kind of this what I call the yuck factor, where people just feel really uncomfortable about doctors mucking around with their brain activity and changing their behaviors with the technology. Okay, let's go to the last thing. Can we change the psychopath himself, with training? So can you train them to be more empathetic? And the bottom line is yes. Empathy is a skill. You just kind of, practice empathy over and over again, and you get better at it. And that's been shown lots of ways. But the problem is practice requires motivation. And why would psychopaths want to be more empathetic? Because to a psychopath, this is what the world looks like. Right? They're the wolf and everyone else are suckers, right? So they view lack of empathy as an advantage, right? So, it's really hard to make them practice more empathy when they think that's going to harm them, right? So finally, we talked about genetic approaches, we talked about modifying the brain, we talked about empathy training, right? Those all have the limitations I've described. So the last thing to think about is, can we somehow change society to make psychopathic individuals less likely to occur? And the answer, I believe, is yes. So let's say, and this is my other baby Kyle, he's 5 years old now, but let's say, and he's not a psychopath, but let's say he was born with psychopathic traits of being fearless, having low levels of empathy, right? So one path is he can become a criminal psychopath, but another path is maybe he can be a surgeon, right? There are careers where a low levels of empathy may be an advantage, like being a surgeon or a CEO or a lawyer, right? These are careers in which low empathy, these are pro-social careers that can take advantage of low levels of empathy. So a person who's born with the psychopathic traits doesn't necessarily have to become a criminal. Maybe they can become a functional member of society, right? And how do we ensure that, how do we make it more likely to make more brain surgeons and fewer criminals, right? Biology is not destiny. I think the key is that psychopaths are rational. So if we set up a world in which the rational choice is to help others, they will do it because they want to do whatever gets them the most stuff, right? We help other people for two reasons. One is it feels good, right? And the other reason is because it helps us get ahead. Actually helping others is actually kind of selfish in that it makes me feel good and it helps me get ahead, right? But psychopaths don't feel good by helping others, right? Because they have that deficient emotional processing. So basically, they're going to be motivated to help other people if it helps them get ahead, right? So how do we create a world where helping others helps them get ahead? A long time ago, Abraham Maslow, a psychologist, had this self-actualization pyramid that basically said, these lower needs have to be met before these higher needs are met. And so there's a line beneath, like, so your most basic needs are physiological, like food, water, and then the next ones are safety. If these needs, if you're living in underneath this line where these needs are not met, then this is a zero-sum world where if you have more food, then I have less food, right? So self and other, acting selfishly does not help the other person. But if we can create a society where these basic needs are met, then suddenly helping others, right? Social needs, esteem needs, helping other people actually helps get our own needs met, right? So basically, if we create a society where basic needs are met, the rules are fair, and the culture rewards altruism, then the rational choice will be to act pro-socially, right? So think about the cultures created by these two different presidents. Which culture rewards psychopathy, essentially, and what culture rewards altruism? Let me just, I know I'm going way over, and I know, and I'll stay longer for questions, but I just want to, if psychopathy is a genetic condition, and we are getting near the end, why hasn't evolution weeded it out, right? So, there's this book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, that, they kind of lists a bunch of careers that are enriched in psychopathy. There's a study that says 1 out of 5 CEOs are psychopaths. So there are careers where that are kind of pro-social in a sense, where low empathy could be helpful, right? And psychopathy exists in a spectrum. So it's not like some people are, so some people are highly, so this is just basically showing you, there's some people, and this is a sample from England, where some people are highly psychopathic and then some people are less psychopathic, and there's everything in between. So in our population, we have some people who are very psychopathic, and maybe that's not an evolutionary advantage, right? But some people are less psychopathic. And so think about the crying baby, right? I doubt that any of us, maybe except for the psychopaths out there, could smother your own baby, even if it meant saving 100 other people, right? But when you think about it, you kind of wish there was a psychopath in that room. It's because someone needs to kill that baby. Just because if you don't kill that baby, the baby still dies, but everyone else dies. So there's some cases where a psychopath can be really helpful, right? So in a weird sense, we might need, so having a few psychopaths, right? Maybe not the full-on super psychopathic people that kill people, maybe like the moderate psychopaths, that can be evolutionally adaptive as a species, because sometimes we need to do bad things to get good things done. Now, this is the final few slides. And so, the question is, and I don't need to imply, so if Donald Trump is a psychopath, is he the psychopath that we need? Because sometimes you could use a psychopath, right? And versus, the president of China, Xi Jinping, right? If he's a psychopath, compare these two people, right? So they're both very cruel, right? But one could argue that the president of China is cruel but effective. And one could argue that Trump is cruel but ineffective, right? And COVID has really brought a lot of this to the fore, right? So, here's China's COVID curve, right? They started off with 7,000 cases, right? And over time, this is their COVID curve over time. They've had 85,000 cases, 4,600 deaths. This is our COVID curve. And notice the graph is, right, this goes up to 100,000. So 8,000 on this graph is here, right? So we're just way off the charts. We've had 9 million cases and over 200,000 deaths, right? And I'm not suggesting we should turn to China. China does many awful things. Xi Jinping is a highly cruel person. He do horrible things to ethnic minorities and to the Tibetans, right? But we could still learn from China, right? We can learn. One of the things that really drives me crazy about Trump's reaction or response to the COVID crisis is that he's made this false dichotomy between public safety and saving the environment, right? China shows that those things are linked, right? So, if Trump's shouting, hey, open everything up as quickly as possible because we need the economy to rebound, right? The thing is, it's not going to rebound until people feel safe, right? And if you're not doing the things to drive the COVID cases down, the economy is not going to rebound. Just yelling at people to open the country up and start to go to bars again isn't going to make it happen. People have to be safe. Public safety and economic rebound are intricately linked. And you can see that in China's response. They drove the COVID pandemic down very quickly, and their GDP has rebounded, right? Almost back to their pre-GDP level. So I'm going to close with this. The New England Journal of Medicine broke from a 208-year history. So New England Journal of Medicine is the most prestigious medical journal in the world. And they broke from their 208-year tradition of not being political by publishing the first political editorial in 208 years. And it was unanimously signed by all 34 editors. That's only happened 4 times in the history of that journal. I've been to enough meetings with doctors to know that to get 34 doctors, especially egotistical doctors at the top of the game, to agree, that's somewhat of a miracle. I'm just going to leave you with some of their words. They said, COVID-19 has created a crisis throughout the world. This crisis has produced a test of leadership. Here in the United States, our leaders have failed that test. They have taken a crisis and turned it into a tragedy. The magnitude of this failure is astonishing. These are not Joe Schmo saying this. These are 34 of the top scientists in the world, all unanimously agreeing about the magnitude of the failure of the Trump administration's response to COVID. Reasonable people will certainly disagree about the many political positions taken by candidates, but truth is neither liberal nor conservative. When it comes to the response to the largest public health crisis of our time, our current political leaders have demonstrated that they are dangerously incompetent. We should not abet them and enable the deaths of thousands more Americans by allowing them to keep their jobs. Thank you. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Tommy.
I'm sorry that went so long, but I just wanted to cram that all in as much as possible.
You're getting a lot of applause, so we're good. And yeah, we'll stick around for a little bit longer for excuse me, for questions, because there are a lot of questions.
Happy to do
However, I have the microphone, so I'm going to make a quick announcement maybe. And Tavi, you don't know this, but I have major depressive disorder, and I had TMS earlier this year, and it changed my life, and it is amazing. And if any of you are out there with depression, I had it for more than a decade. I still probably do, but I'm feeling great even in this climate. Please, honestly, get in touch with me. Send a message to Science on Tap on Facebook, or send me an email or something, because it's amazing. And the only reason I knew about it was because somebody who I follow online talked about it, and that's where I found out about it. So I'm telling you, please get in touch with me. I would be glad to tell you about my experience with TMS. So
that's so great to hear. That is so great to hear. TMS is the greatest, treatment for depression that no one's heard of, including doctors. Most doctors haven't heard of it. So as many people as possible need to know about it.
Yeah, that I did not anticipate talking about that tonight, but
you know how I learned about TMS? Because I was a doctor, I didn't know about TMS. From watching Neil Brennan, Three Mics, brilliant stand-up show on Netflix. I recommend everyone to watch it. But he spends a lot of that show talking about his own depression and the treatments he sought for it, TMS being one of those treatments. And at the end of that show, I thought, like, what is TMS? I haven't even heard of this thing before.
Yeah, you and I can talk about it a little bit more later.
Sure. Lots of questions, I'm sure, to get to.
But again, to any of you who are suffering from long-term depression, please get in touch with me, and please investigate TMS, because I sound like an evangelist, but it's really been life-changing. So now onto your questions, the questions from the talk. Have a lot of people curious about the difference between psychopath and sociopath, and antisocial personality disorder and narcissist. Can you talk a little bit about those terms?
Yeah, boy, that's a whole lot of different questions. I think the easiest thing to say is sociopathy or sociopaths. The research literature does not distinguish between psychopathy and sociopathy. They're basically identical. But I've noticed in kind of layman's terms, the way lay people use it, sociopathy seems to refer to kind of a milder condition of psychopathy, where maybe you have some of those core things of low empathy, but you're not necessarily of the full-blown criminal psychopath. So again, that goes back to the psychopathy spectrum, right? Of some people have a mild version, some people have a more severe version. And so the bottom line is, I think sociopathy, essentially the way we use it in the lay public, refers to a milder version of psychopathy that may not necessarily have the criminal behaviors associated with it. Antisocial personality disorder is a personality disorder in the DSM. Interestingly, psychopathy is not a diagnosis in the DSM, and that has to do with a turf battle between the psychologists like Robert Hare and the psychiatrists who control the DSM. So there's a fascinating backstory to that. But basically, antisocial personality disorder describes two different mutually exclusive populations. One is psychopaths, but it also describes a whole bunch of other people who don't have that core emotional defect of being callous and non-empathetic, but they engage in a lot of criminal behaviors. So antisocial personality disorder is a bit of a garbage bucket that conflates a lot of different categories together, which is why I don't really talk about it much. But basically, you can be antisocial, engage in a lot of criminal behaviors, but not be a psychopath. So you can engage in criminal behavior just because you're poor and you've been traumatized and you need money and food, or if someone, you have a history of trauma and someone taps you on the shoulder and you overreact and you act violently. That's an antisocial person who acts antisocially, but for way different reasons than psychopaths, which are driven by the core of low empathy.
Let's see, Britt asks the questions, are psychopaths immune to getting PTSD?
That is such a good question. And I've never read a paper that said that, but I have thought the same thing. Essentially, I believe psychopathy and PTSD are mutually exclusive conditions. The PTSD is essentially an overreaction to a aversive stimulus, like a trauma, right? That just gets really amplified. And when you look at the neurobiology of people with PTSD, their amygdalas are overactive and they get triggered by the littlest thing, right? Versus psychopathy, it's like the opposite end of that spectrum where they have really underactive amygdalas. So I think psychopathy is a protective factor for trauma.
In a related question, I guess, Soraya asks, do psychopaths suffer?
I think you'd have to ask a psychopath, but really, think about that Ted Bundy slide where someone asked him if he felt guilt, right? I mean, they don't feel guilt the same way. I mean, and again, it's a spectrum. So some people might feel a little guilt. Some people, the severe psychopaths, probably feel no guilt. So they don't suffer in terms of that. They don't suffer from anxiety generally. But psychopaths still fly off the handle very easily. They get angry very easily. So if you consider that a form of suffering, but they're not the most reflective people, right? They have a shallow affect. They don't have a rich psychological life, because that rich psychological life, you develop that, Amanda, probably from watching lots of movies and talking to lots of people, and you kind of really develop this rich model of what other people are like. If you don't have that, then it's hard to be reflective. And so I don't think they suffer nearly as much as people without psychopathy.
You touched on this a little bit towards the end, but Brooke asked a question kind of in the beginning, and I'd like for you to reiterate a little bit about this. Can you have psychopaths who don't commit crimes, at least nothing major, but still meet the criteria?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, when you look at those 20 criteria, right? I mean, each one of those is worth 2 points, and you just have to get over 30, right? That's the official definition of a clinical psychopath as defined by the psychopathy checklist. So you can get to that score without any of those antisocial behaviors, any of those criminal recidivism, all those antisocial factors. You can still get to 30 just by meeting all the other factors. So there's different kinds of psychopaths. I mean, I glossed over it, but there's different ways to get to 30 points, basically. And people have described different kind of subsets of psychopaths. But yeah, you can get there without acting criminally.
We've had a couple of questions about autism and connection with psychopathy. And one of our anonymous attendees asks, can masking in autism sometimes look like psychopathy? Can you be autistic and psychopathic, assuming at the same time, or is that an error?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think having autism does increase your risk of committing crimes. And I've been, involved in several cases of people with autism who, the problem with autism, and there's many different kind of problems of autism, but one of the core deficits in autism is this inability to mentalize, to understand what someone else might be thinking or feeling, right? So psychopaths can understand what other people might be thinking, right? Which allows them to really lie really well and manipulate other people. They have difficulty understanding what other people are feeling though, right? So with autism, they have both those problems. They have deficits in empathy, like a feeling what other people are feeling, right? So you might think that might predispose them a bit more to committing crimes, but the problem is they also have difficulty in understanding what other people are thinking. So that, I haven't come across a person with autism who's a good liar. Right, to lie well, you need to be able to manipulate someone else's mind really well, and so they're helped by that impairment. They're less able to commit crimes because they're less able to manipulate other people, if that makes sense. But they do commit more crimes that require like understanding of intent. So the cases I've been involved in with autistic defendants have been sexual assault crimes where really the person with autism had very little idea the other person didn't want their sexual advances, right? And that's because of this problem with mentalization.
You talked about twins and how if identical twins are, if one is a psychopath, then both probably are, whereas fraternal twins maybe not.
Right.
Leah asked about the epigenetic influences or considerations with psychopathy. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah. I have not I haven't read any papers regarding epigenetics and psychopathy. So for people who don't know, basically epigenetics is a mechanism, it's a type of cellular memory. It's a way that the body can store certain kinds of memories, like traumatic memories, not in the neural circuits in our brain, but actually in the genetic code by kind of chemical modifications of the DNA, which then affect how much different genes are expressed. Um, so I don't know much about that. I don't, so a lot of the epigenetic work it looks at trauma. So people who have experienced a lot of trauma have a lot of epigenetic changes to their DNA. And it's thought that is one way that trauma is passed down from generation to generation, actually. But outside of epigenetics for trauma, I'm not aware of like a lot of other epigenetic research. And maybe, if you're knowledgeable, please reach out to me and teach me. I'm suitably humble about how much data is out there. But really, the epigenetic data is about trauma and psychopathy. It's not about trauma. Most of these people who are psychopaths did not have a traumatic background.
Speaking of background, this question fits into that. Gabrielle was asking about, she would also be interested if there are neurological differences between sexes, given that most research is done on men. Do women just present differently? Any research she can have would be appreciated.
Yeah, I'm kind of a dummy on female psychopaths. They do exist. So Diane Downs is one of them that I discussed, and one of the most famous psychopaths in history is Lizzie Borden, this kind of famous serial killer at the turn of the 18th century, who murdered lots of people. So there are not nearly as many studies on women than men, and when you do kind of look at those studies, it's basically a lot more rare. And so the number is thrown out as there's a 5-to-1 proportion. For every female psychopath, there's 5 male psychopaths. And I don't think I know the literature well enough to give an expert opinion on why that difference occurs. One thing that comes to mind is, I didn't discuss this, but, many of the criminal psychopaths are highly aggressive, right? Like, there's little kids that just want to mutilate little animals, for instance. They're not just lacking in empathy, they actually have this kind of foot on the grass pedal of like being highly aggressive. We know aggression is genetically encoded. So, I would imagine, and, a lot of aggression is mediated by testosterone. So I would imagine testosterone has a lot to do with the levels of aggression that then convert a low empathy person to an aggressive, violent, criminal psychopath. That's why it would happen more in men.
Related to that, what should parents of probable psychopaths do?
Yeah, so that's a very relevant question, and there's someone, there's someone in my family that, the parents are worried about, that, is this kid, he seems very aggressive, does not learn from punishment, seems to have a low level of empathy. And so, if you're just moderately, psychopathic or callous unemotional, is what we call them, kids, then you can do empathy training. You can get that person into intensive, specialized psychotherapy to kind of help boost up their, every skill that we have is a combination of some genetic predisposition, how good you are to it, and level of practice. So one can practice empathy with specific kinds of therapy. If you have a high level of psychopathy, as a youth, that's a really tough population. And there is promising studies though, and these kind of treatments are not widespread. But R.G.R. Blair, one of the psychopathy researchers I've mentioned, recently left his post at the NIMH to go to the Boys Town, which is the Center for Troubled Youths. So he runs a very highly funded center that does intensive, specialized therapy on youths that are highly psychopathic, and he's getting good results. So basically you need high intensity training and specialized training. If you just do the regular kind of therapy with psychopaths, often, there's this famous studies that shows that psychopaths, it's an old study, but psychopaths who were exposed to group therapy actually turned out worse. They did worse. They became more psychopathic. And one psychopath who was involved in the study said, yeah, that group therapy was great. It was like a finishing school for other people's vulnerabilities. Like they learned how to manipulate other people by being in this group therapy session. So one does have to be careful with the kind of therapy. that's provided.
Question about more adult folks with psychopathy. How does alcohol affect psychopaths with respect to truth or lying? Do they tend to avoid alcohol to avoid being caught in their lies? Indeed, are they at all concerned about being found out about lying and being a psychopath?
Well, anecdotally, when psychopaths are caught in a lie, they are extremely cavalier. They're kind of laugh it off. They go, whatever. I mean, it doesn't seem to affect them at all that they were caught in a lie, no matter how big the lie was. So that's really, that's abnormal compared to a non-psychopath. Yeah, and what was the first part of the question, Amanda?
About alcohol, does it
Oh, right,
affect
yeah.
them? Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know specifically about alcohol, but in general, psychopaths do abuse substances at a higher rate than non-psychopaths. And part of that's because they have this need for stimulation. Their amygdalas are really underactive. So they're constantly looking for ways to get sensation, right? To feel something, right? So I would just speculate that they use alcohol at a higher rate as well. And I would imagine it would affect their lying ability the way it affects everyone else, which is, once your frontal lobes are taken offline, you have less inability to inhibit other things, right? And you're less able to solve this puzzle of generating a plausible lie and keeping track of the lies you told before to be consistent and all that stuff. So I would predict alcohol would work in a similar fashion with lies.
A question that just popped up a minute ago is, can a psychopath fall in love?
I think a psychopath can have a mutually beneficial transactional relationship with other people, but love, requires empathy. It requires really understanding what someone else is experiencing, right, and being attuned to that person. So again, psychopathy is a spectrum, right? So I mean, if you're mildly psychopathic, you can experience some level of love. If you're highly psychopathic, you probably experience a lot less level of love. Love is based on empathy. They can certainly make you feel like they love you, though. They're highly manipulative and they're glib and they're superficially charming. So Ted Bundy, I mean, he got 100 women, in his little car.
And I think I mentioned this, but I'm not sure you touched on it exactly. What is a narcissist, and how does a narcissist fit into this spectrum?
Certainly psychopaths are narcissistic, and that has to do with, their psychopathy checklists. There's, having a grandiose sense of self-worth, right? Being egocentric. So that is part of narcissism. Separately, there is a personality disorder in the DSM called narcissistic personality disorder, which basically privileges your own kind of experience over other people's. And so, again, there's this kind of uncomfortable tension between psychopathy, which is a term from psychology, and the DSM, which is in the world of psychiatry. And so things don't mesh quite well. But I would say that narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder is incorporated as part of the checklist of psychopathy. But one can also be purely narcissistic and not a psychopath. So I did my residency training at UCLA. Tons of narcissists, lots of agents, right? Talent agents out there. They're super narcissistic, but they're not psychopaths, right? They don't enjoy hurting other people. They're just full of themselves, right?
So a narcissist, the definition would be somebody who's just totally self-focused. Is that?
Yeah, someone who privileges their own experiences and over other people's. And so again, narcissism is its own thing. Psychopathy is narcissism plus a whole lot of other things.
We had a bunch of people asking about that, so I just wanted to drill down a little bit.
Yeah.
So let's do just one or two more questions. Eric asks, if the punishment mechanism is diminished in a psychopath, isn't the reward mechanism diminished too? And you talked about the amygdala maybe not letting the pleasure center work as well. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, no, it's actually so. So the reward center. So nucleus accumbens is commonly thought of as the reward center. And so actually, although the literature is controversial, there are at least some studies that show that psychopaths have overactive reward centers. Nucleus accumbens is overactive, so they're actually super sensitive to immediate reward. That's what makes them highly hedonic, right? Kind of like they're really into immediate gratification because it's like those donuts look super good to them, right? So actually, when you look at the specialized therapy that's offered to psychopathic youths in these facilities that do this high intensity training, they're not punishment based at all. They're highly reward based, and those rewards are immediate. There's this there's this kind of like a point system that you can start gathering points immediately, right? Because you can't wait. Psychopaths can't wait, right? So you give them immediate rewards, and eventually you kind of build up that reward system over time so they can look forward to more distant rewards. And you kind of build that skill of delayed gratification.
A question about the legal system. You touched on that a little bit at the end, and I know that you are an expert witness in situations. Question, Jordy has a question about, has our understanding of psychopathy affected the court/prison system? For example, could someone be denied parole because of it?
Yes, they can. Psychopathy. So any kind of when you claim a broken brain is responsible for someone's bad behaviors, that's a double-edged sword, because in one sense it can be aggravating that you have this broken brain, because you have this broken brain, can't be fixed, and it makes you more dangerous. On the other hand, if a broken brain caused bad behaviors, it makes you less culpable, right? It makes you kind of less responsible for your bad behaviors if you have a broken brain. So, the legal concept of a broken brain can actually be either aggravating or a mitigating, condition, and really has to do with the skill of the lawyer that presents the condition. It's either aggravating or, so prosecutors will say psychopathy, it's a biological condition, that's an aggravating condition. Defense lawyers will argue exactly the opposite. And so when that judges study that I showed, there's this tension. It could be aggravating, it could be mitigating, but on the whole, it's slightly mitigating. That's what we found.
So I know that there are a lot of questions we haven't gotten to, but I want to respect everyone's time and finish up. But I have one more question from myself. And that question is, why do you, Tavi, why do you feel it's important for people to learn about science?
It's never been more important to learn about science. And one of the reasons I'm speaking out against Trump, and just like the New England Journal of Medicine for the first time, just like the Scientific American editorial for the very first time, is because science is under assault, and that is seriously fucked up. Science is our best way to help us understand the physical world and objective truths. And I'm not saying that science knows every truth. There are different kinds of truth. There's spiritual truths, there are personal truths, there's the soul. There's so much richness that is outside of science, yet science is the best way we can discern what is objectively true about the universe. And if we have an administration that actively denies objective truth, then you're living in delusion. It is impossible to make wise decisions when those decisions are predicated on delusions. Right? So we need to know science. We have to value science. Science is what's beaming these electrons and bouncing them off of satellites and beaming them into your living room from my living room. It's amazing, right? And it actually works. Not to say that science knows everything, not to say that science doesn't make errors and we're getting better and better at certain things, but in general, science is the best way to discern what is objectively true. And that is the best foundation to make wise decisions. The other thing I would say about science is that for me personally, it's a source of hope. The world is so messed up right now, and there's so many problems. There's global warming, there's the pandemic. But when I think about science, it's my happy place. Science, moves forward. There's brilliant people all around the world constantly pushing forward, particle physics and with biology and with neuroscience and, with engineers. There's so many brilliant people collectively working to discern these objective truths, and in a very tangible way, making the world better. When you look at the graph of how humans have done with technology, it's like this, right? The last 100 years of technological progress is equal to like the previous 5,000 years. So science is hopeful, and it's accelerating too, right? So I'm highly hopeful that the next 10 years, the next 50 years is going to bring forth all sorts of breakthroughs, all sorts of unknowns of things that we should be happy about that we just don't know about yet.
That is an amazing answer. So thank you for that. And I too see science as hope, and I hope that the folks that are still online watching with us can take that to hope, or take that hope as well. And vote, please, everyone, vote. And thank you, Dr. Octavio Choi, for joining us here this evening. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but there were a lot of questions, and hopefully we got a lot of information for you. I'm going to share. Oh, go
I
ahead.
just want to say thank you and thank the entire support team. That's kind of your invisible helper elves being behind the scenes. You guys are doing a great job. Science is so important. Getting science out to the people in different venues. I can't wait to go back to Portland and start doing these things in bars again, which tends to be a really good experience. But it's so important. Science education is so important. So everyone out there, donate a few bucks. Donate $5 to the organization. It makes a difference. And just thank you so much for the opportunity to talk.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everyone who has joined us here this evening. I'm going to share my screen just real quick and mention a couple of quick things. As Tavi mentioned, we could use your help. Science on Tap. We need donations. That's the only way we're making money these days. So if you found tonight's talk valuable, Tavi has generously donated his time, but we have to pay for Zoom and we have to pay for lots of things. And we've got a whole staff of people behind the scenes. And it's really important for you, our attendees, to help us out if you are available or able to. I know that a lot of people are struggling right now, and I want to keep these free for as long as possible so that we can have as many people view our events and our podcasts as we can, because as we've said, science education is very important. So there's two ways to donate. You can make a one-time donation through makeyoutthink.org/support, or you can do an ongoing donation through our Patreon at patreon.com/makeyoutthink. And wanted to let you know what is coming up next. Our next event, we're taking next week off because I couldn't deal with doing an event the same week as the election. So we're taking next week off. But the following week on November 12th at 7 p.m., we will be talking about a good time to be born, how science and public health gave children a future, with author and pediatrician Dr. Perry Klass. And Perry will be joined by David Oshinsky, who's also a doctor and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, professor at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. So again, that will be on Thursday, November 12 at 7 p.m. Pacific. And just a quick shout out to our now 116, actually I think 117 Patreon supporters. I saw somebody come through during the talk. These are the folks who are donating $10 or more per month. You are hugely, we're so grateful to all of you for joining us. It really genuinely makes a difference. And if any of you are waiting for pint glasses or stickers, I figured I would wait until after the USPS was dealing with all the political or the voting situation. So I'm going to wait until next week to mail all of that stuff out. So if you're waiting, keep an eye out after the election. And also wanted to say a quick thank you a special thank you to one of our Patreon supporters, Carol Stewart. Thank you, Carol. And coming back to this slide, if you are able to donate, we greatly appreciate it. Thank you all so much for coming. If anybody has questions about TMS, please contact me. I've already gotten 2 names that I will be writing to you very shortly after. And thank you, Tavi, for joining us this evening. And everyone have a great evening. And please, please go vote.
Word. Thank you.